Okay, so this is the study guide review for exam one. Okay, so I'm going to go through it pretty quick. I tried to outline the study guide where it gives you a specific idea of the section inside of your book and, and or PowerPoint to kind of focus on. So you can kind of find it in your notes and all that fun stuff, but I'll just kind of, be a little more specific here. Okay, so why are families violent? Structural factors, right? We talked about, again, in your book, we talk about how there's often power differences in the family, right? Like where parents have power over children. Often in a patriarchal family system, husbands have power over their wives, or often, you know, adult children will have power over their elderly parents. So that, leads to issues of violence. The amount of time a family spends together is an effect. Also, you know, if there's dependency issues, so if someone's financially or otherwise dependent on their either parents or their spouse or one of those things, that is related to that as well. And also the idea that in the culture we really think that the family is private and that we should stay, that it's a something that shouldn't be talked about behind closed doors kind of thing. Um, the idealization of the family. All I'm looking for there is just this idea that we have this kind of family is a safe haven kind of thing in society, that we promote this idea that parents are always going to act, with their children's best interests in mind. But that's not necessarily true, right? And that really affects people that are in those situations. And it also kind of obscures the fact that this is a real cultural issue. Let's see, why from this one? Oh, so social tolerance, again, culture, meaning that in our society, not only do we tolerate violence in the family and have we historically tolerated family violence, but it's also something that we consider normal, like as an expression, and so much so that it's kind of what we consider entertainment, right? So um, obviously, in cultures that think that violence is normal for certain situations, that's going to kind of open the door to justifications of violence within the family. Um, Definitions. Why is it important? Because we were talking about how, you know, if you don't have a definition that reflects how this situation actually works, so if you don't have a clear definition of child abuse or what it means, what it looks like, those kind of things, then how do we make laws that address it, right? Myths. So basically, if you look at that last couple slides of the presentation, I'm just drawing from those. So, some of those examples would be the idea that women ask for abuse, or like, why don't they just leave? That family violence is pretty normal, right? That if you were abused as a child, you always become an abusive parent or partner. Not true. That alcohol and drugs are the real reason that people. Anyway, any of those ones, those are the ones I'm focusing on for that question. Okay, so for the chapter two stuff, macro theory explanation variables, those are the variables that are on the slide, such as modeling, classical conditioning, operant conditioning, trauma theory. That's really what I'm looking for. Of course, any of those kind of variables, the micro theory variables, patriarchy, socialization, stress, violence, or more so approval of violence, right? All of those things on the slide there. And then I want you to understand the difference between classical and operant conditioning. This is why I gave you guys that video that really outlines it well. So I really suggest you watch the video again as a reference before the exam. But the classical, most people recognize it as what the kind of Pavlov's dog thing is connecting two events together, like the dog hearing the bell and salivating because he thinks because previously the bell was associated with food, versus operant conditioning, which is this idea that you should have active responses to what things you do, that basically you're punished or rewarded, and that influences your behavior. Let's see, sources of data. Obviously, we were talking about this in class, the official reports, there's self-reports, victimization surveys, and of course, direct observations that come from like CPS workers and different organizations that deal with family violence. Um, let's see, chapter 3. So that was pretty quick. Chapter 3. Again, these are really specific, the section of the book, but I'll kind of narrow in again. Um, let's see. So as far as neglected children, there's a lot of different characteristics. Um, but one of the things that we talked about was the issue of disability for neglected children. That's kind of what that question is going to focus on. Let's see. For characteristics of neglectful parents, what I want you to kind of look at there, because there's lots of different characteristics that I talk about, but just specifically gender. Um, let's see, long-term effects of psychological maltreatment. So just a lot of those things we talked about were that, if you go through psychological maltreatment, you're going to be more anxious, face more depression, maybe distrust people or be very vulnerable to stress, right? Let's see, co-occurrence. It just means that domestic violence often happens in the same time as child abuse is happening. So they often happen at this, it's often the same perpetrator committing those two different acts concurrently. Let's see, socioeconomic status. Obviously, that's a strong predictor of neglect because if people don't have the money to provide, food, clothes, adequate shelter, support for their kids, then that's going to lead to neglect. Let's see. Parenting problems. So what's interesting there is this idea that so obviously they think that since single parents have higher risks, that it's better for parents to be in the home, like to have two parents in the home. But that's not necessarily true if the father or the spouse is a alcoholic or drug addict. So, if it's better to have a single parent situation in that situation than have someone that's going through alcohol or drug abuse because they're going to be so unstable that it's actually better in that situation to have a single parent. So it's this kind of weird thing we talked about this kind of on one hand, you want both parents in the house, but on the other hand, if one of the parents is very destructive, you don't want them in the house at all. Okay, moving on to chapter 4. This idea that spillover effects of spanking, that once spanking is normalized and hitting and, using physical violence to, portray fault or error or something was wrong, kind of is a slippery slope, is what they're saying, to other forms of family violence. So if a kid gets spanked a lot at home, they're more likely to hit their siblings if they have conflicts with their siblings. There's a lot of research that looks at how, if it's normative enough to strike a child for when they do something wrong, does that spill over into the marital relationship, right? If one of the spouses perceives the other to have done something wrong, do they slap them? Do they hit them? Right? That kind of spillover effect of once you normalize using violence to deal with these things, it often can kind of seep into other situations. Let's see. What was the next one? Oh, long-term effects associated with child physical abuse. I mean, obviously, those we talked about how some of those issues can be long-term, like a head injury is going to affect you for a long time. If you get burned, you're going to have those scars for a long time. So some of those long-term effects can be very detrimental. Postpartum, we talked about that before, this idea that a lot of women go through this kind of hormonal and brain chemical shift, or they don't really know exactly, but where often they'll have disturbing thoughts about hurting their babies or just have hard time kind of, enjoying things in the same way that they did before, or it's a very common occurrence that happens because of the kind of just, you push a human person out of your body. That's obviously going to affect kind of the chemistry of what's going on there. But it was so stigmatized in the culture for so long that most women didn't talk about it. So it's only recently that we've kind of got more people screening for it or bringing women an awareness of it so that they don't feel like they're going through it alone. Munchausen by proxy is this really interesting thing where a parent will basically poison or hurt their kid or somehow harm them so that they can be a good parent, so that they can be the parent that's like, oh, look, they're taking care of their sick kid. What a great mom, right? And I shared that kind of extra story thing with you guys online if you're interested. Super weird and interesting. Okay, social learning theory, just this idea that when um, when you learn that violence is the way that you deal with issues, oftentimes you'll reproduce that. So let's say you grow up in a home where abuse is common, then you may be more likely to abuse than someone who didn't grow up in that situation because it's been normalized to you, because it's been justified, and just kind of like, oh, well, that's what you do. That's how you respond, right? That's what social learning theory says. Polyvictimization is this idea that um, oftentimes um, people will experience um, more than one issue at once, meaning, kind of going back to the co-occurrence idea that you're going to, if you're looking and you're seeing maybe neglect, then there might also be child abuse, and there might also be CSA, there might also be whatever it is, right? And so it's important to kind of understand how a lot of these things are occurring at the same time. Grandparenting is this research basically that's been done to say that basically if a grandparent's around, there's less incidence of severe child abuse. Okay, chapter 5. Characteristics of CSA victims. I'm looking again there for gender. Characteristics of perpetrators. Again, gender. Those ones are easy. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so when I'm talking about prostitution, it's that thing we talked about in the book, how the majority of prostitutes started working as prostitutes before the age of 16. That's all I wanted to focus on there. The initial effects of CSA, I'm looking for PTSD and the mimicking of sexual behavior. The long term, well, there's a lot more of those that we talked about in class, such as, behavioral stuff like eating disorders, sexual phobias, trust issues, emotional issues like anger, depression. Okay, factors, the increased trauma. We talked about how, the duration and severity are those kind of things. And of course, who is the person doing the abuse? Like if this is supposed to be like a parent or someone that you trust. So we talked about that. And, if there's invasive forms of sexual activity, that's also going to be more traumatic. Okay, so then we looked at the different theories, like the theories that focus on the victim, of course, are a little victim blamey, right? And then the saying that the victim somehow kind of asked for the abuse. Focus on the offender is kind of saying that maybe this person has psychological problems, right? Or maybe they were abused as a kid. And the focus on the family is just kind of saying that often the families are very dysfunctional. They have some of these older theories that blame the moms, right? Saying that they either contribute or they aren't having enough sex with their husband and that's why it's happening, right? Those kind of different older theories. And of course, when we're looking at the culture, we need to understand how the sexualization that's happening in the media, especially towards children, really strongly affects, our kind of normative cultural notions of whether or not some child has been harmed. Okay, so then child called these are pretty straightforward. So where did David think he was going, right? It was really sad. He thought he was going to jail, right? Because he thought he'd done something wrong. So that's why I wanted you to focus on that. His recollection of the good times, I mean, that's kind of the answer is that, right? Basically that it shows that these things are complicated, right? It's not as if his childhood was horrible or great. It's that it can go in waves. And that it's important to kind of look at how you can't discount a situation of abuse by saying, well, at some point they look like a happy family, right? And that's often how those things get obscured. Okay, so for chapter 3 and 4, his mother's changing behavior, obviously, the incidents of abuse seem to change when, his mother was more lethargic and moody. She started drinking more. right? And because of that, the abuse got a lot worse. Um, you know, the obviously Dave's arm was injured in by his mother, but the way that she played it was as if he fell off the top bunk, which was really kind of shows the planning, the way to kind of protect what's going on there. Um, Obviously, food was used as a way to control David, because basically he couldn't eat unless he'd done what she considered, basically any single tiny what could be perceived as an infraction. It would be a reason not to eat. He would often just eat the scraps or bits off of his siblings' plates that were left over, and that kind of left him desperate. Which, of course, that's one of the main ways people torture people, right? Is controlling their food and water sources. Obviously, the stealing the food at school made it so that he was unpopular with other students. The teacher were, not cool with that, obviously, and the principal wasn't great with that. So that really affected the way that they saw him as deviant. And then when it comes to this short answer essay questions, I'm looking at how does social learning theory explain incidents of child abuse? So again, kind of going back to explain what the theory says and how it relates itself to child abuse, this idea that we learn from our parents and we try to reproduce these things. So what does that mean? It's intergenerational. How does it pass on, etc. And I want to see both answers for that question, right? Number two, long-term effects. So you can pick any of the forms of abuse or neglect that we've discussed and talk about some of the long-term effects. And then for the second part, connect why it's important for the criminal justice system or CPS to know these long-term effects. I want you to kind of stress why we need to have a more holistic view of this so that we can see people that have gone through the system later down the road and maybe give them services and, things that are catered towards their specific experiences instead of just kind of throwing them in as criminals and almost like re-victimizing them in that system. Okay, so hopefully this helps, and this has been your exam review.